Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The sun hung like a gold coin flickering at the edge of the sky, casting long, lazy shadows across the neatly swept compound of Daniel and Miriam's home. The evening had ripened slowly, with the kind of stillness that made sound stretch, cutlery clinking softly, sandals shuffling on tiled floors, laughter dipping in and out of rooms like smoke. From afar, theirs looked like a home kissed by the gods. 2 clean cars in the driveway, a smartly painted duplex trimmed with flowering bougainvillea, and the smell of grilled tilapia wafting gently through the backyard. Inside, a low chorus of conversation floated around the living room where friends gathered for their 7th wedding anniversary. Bottles of palm wine stood half-emptied, surrounded by empty plates of peppered snail and jollof rice, the kind that stuck slightly to the bottom of the pot, just enough to be considered a delicacy. Miriam wore a red lace gown, hand-stitched and sent from Aruma by her cousin, with a head tie wrapped like a promise she hadn't made in years. Her smile was soft, controlled, the way one might hold a cup filled too high. She had spent the day stirring stew with her fingers and directing caterers like a conductor at work. Yet, with each passing hour, something underneath her eyelids dimmed. Daniel had barely looked her way, except when guests asked for a picture. His laughter rang out, clear and deep, but it had no roots. Even as he toasted to forever and fortune, his right thumb grazed the screen of his phone over and over, swiping through messages like they were more urgent than the moment. Miriam noticed, but she said nothing. She had learned, over the years, how to silence her questions until they built rooms inside her chest. When the final guest had waved their last goodbye and the compound slipped back into the hush of night, Miriam was in the kitchen wrapping leftover pepper soup into takeaway bowls. She heard the scrape of a chair on the floor behind her and sensed the weight of Daniel's presence before he spoke. He didn't clear his throat or soften his tone, just spoke plainly, like he was reading the price of something on a receipt. "They called again about the land," he said. "This time they're offering more than double." Miriam didn't turn. Her hands continued folding foil over a bowl, as if the sentence didn't exist. "Which land?" she asked flatly, though she already knew. Daniel hated when she did that, feigned ignorance, pulled him into clarity he should have owned. "Aruma," he said, stepping closer. "That land is doing nothing. You've sat on it for years. It's time we make something of it." This time she turned, slow as dusk. Her face was unreadable, carved into something old and steady. "Doing nothing?" she repeated. "That land fed 3 generations. That land holds the bones of my people. It knows my name in the way you don't." Daniel scoffed, running a hand across his beard like he was dragging off patience. "Miriam, stop talking like a priestess. This is business. I'm trying to help you help yourself. You can't keep living in the past." Her voice dropped low. "I didn't ask for help." Then she turned away again, opened the refrigerator, and let the cold hum fill the room. Daniel's hand came down flat on the kitchen counter. "You're not hearing me. That land is ours, not just yours." Silence slipped between them, heavy and wide. That's when it happened. His palm rose and met her cheek with a sound that didn't echo. It sank. It was not loud, but it was enough. Miriam froze. Time thinned. The pepper soup bowl slid from her fingers and shattered. Her face turned slightly to the side, not out of pain but disbelief, as though her skin itself had been betrayed. The wind outside knocked once on the window pane like it too had felt the tremor. There was no scream, no curses thrown. Miriam straightened slowly, her jaw tightening. Her left hand touched her cheek as if to check whether it had truly happened, and her eyes moved back to him, not with tears, but with a calm that unnerved. "You should never have done that," she said, her voice quieter than a whisper, but heavier than thunder. "You think because I followed you to this city, I left everything behind." She shook her head, a bitter smile crawling up the side of her mouth. "You never really saw me. Not the real me, just the woman you wanted to tame." Daniel's face was a mix of confusion and poorly masked regret, but pride held him back from reaching out. "You need to calm down," he muttered. She laughed just once, the kind of laugh that didn't carry joy, only realization. "You're not worth my anger," she said, already walking past him. Her wrapper dragged gently on the floor, and her earrings swayed like tiny pendulums marking the end of something sacred. She picked up her car keys from the dining table, slipped her sandals on, and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" Daniel called after her, his voice rising slightly, catching panic. She didn't answer. She opened the door, and before walking out, turned one last time. "You thought you married a quiet girl with no history," she said. "But you forgot. I had power long before I had a husband." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Daniel alone in a house that suddenly felt colder than the night outside. Out on the road, the city blinked around her in tired neon lights and the hum of generators. She drove without music, the car engine whispering to the road like it knew this path had been waiting to be taken. Her heart didn't race. It moved with the rhythm of something ancient and familiar. Streetlights flickered past, but her mind was already far beyond their reach, beyond the traffic lights, beyond the radio static, beyond the skyline of Amma River City. She didn't cry. Crying would have been a gift too tender for a man like Daniel. Instead, her thoughts stretched back to a place where stories were carved into walls and names were buried beneath cola trees. She thought of her grandmother, Mma Ojago, who once walked barefoot into a chief's palace and came out owning the very compound they mocked her in. Miriam's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Her mother used to say, "The land does not forget its daughters." And now it was calling her back, not in desperation, but in power. The road ahead was long and narrow, slicing through hills and whispers. She didn't care about where she'd sleep or who would greet her at dawn. All she knew was that her silence had ended, and whatever came next would rise from the soil that remembered her name more than Daniel ever could. The wind that brushed against her car window felt heavier the farther she drove, like it carried the breath of 1,000 unseen watchers. The air no longer smelled of gasoline and paved streets, but of cracked soil, palm leaves, old secrets, and things left unsaid. The headlights sliced through the rural roads like a cautious blade, illuminating only what it needed to, hiding the rest in shadows thick enough to swallow memory. The city was behind her now, swallowed in rear-view reflections and the dust of goodbye. Miriam didn't check her mirrors much. What use was there in watching a road she no longer cared to return to? She moved forward, the tires humming steadily beneath her, as if the road itself remembered her weight, as though it had once held her feet and now welcomed her home like a child who'd lost her way. Every tree she passed, every rusted signpost, every narrow curve of the road whispered to her like old aunties telling bedtime stories around a smoky lantern. This was not escape. It was reclamation. The farther she moved from Daniel's world, the lighter her bones began to feel, as though a crown too long buried was adjusting itself back onto her head, inch by silent inch. She took one hand off the steering wheel and opened the window wider, letting the air slap against her cheek, the same cheek he'd struck earlier that night. But this wind felt nothing like that slap. This wind was wild, yes, but it was hers. The slap was already fading, not from memory, but from relevance. What he had done out of ignorance, and ignorance had no place where she was going. Yuruma appeared like a dream slowly stirring awake. No city gates, no neon signs, just a quiet settlement cradled between two sleeping hills, where night crickets sang lullabies and lanterns flickered through window holes carved into red mud walls. The road narrowed as she approached the village, and the car tires shifted from gravel to the soft, familiar thud of earth, the kind of earth that sticks to your soles and stains your spirit with belonging. She parked beside a row of pawpaw trees that had grown taller than she remembered, their fruits drooping like shy heads under moonlight. As she stepped out, the wind changed again, cooler now, less urgent, like it was relieved she had finally arrived. Her heels sank a little into the earth as she walked, her breath caught somewhere between memory and morning. The old house stood in the distance, wrapped in shadow and overgrown vines, its shape unmistakable despite time's attempts to erase it. The compound was quiet, not lifeless, but listening. Miriam paused for a moment, taking it all in, the crooked roof, the cracked veranda tiles, the single lantern swinging gently in the night breeze, like a forgotten heartbeat. It wasn't the same, but it hadn't forgotten her. Every step she took toward it felt like retracing footsteps left behind by someone else, someone stronger, someone who once walked barefoot through this village with a name that echoed louder than her laughter. She reached the door and ran her hand along its wooden surface, splinters digging slightly into her fingers. Her grandmother's presence lingered there, in the way the hinges groaned, in the air thick with old wood smoke and eucalyptus leaves. Inside, the air was heavy with silence, not the uncomfortable silence of city apartments or marital arguments, but the silence of memory and waiting. Dust lay in soft blankets over everything, chairs carved by hand, a stool polished by decades of use, and a cracked photograph of her father smiling without teeth. She left the lantern burning on a hook and walked further in, her fingers trailing along the wall like she was trying to read its history by touch. She entered her grandmother's old room, and though the mattress had caved in from years of absence, the smell was still there, shea butter, charcoal, and camphor. It was the scent of guidance, of whispered warnings, of stories told in half-sleep. She sat down on the wooden bed frame and closed her eyes. The silence wrapped around her like a shawl, and then a creak, soft, distant, but real. Not from the house, but from the trees outside. She walked to the back of the house, to the grove where the old shrine was hidden under layers of moss and thyme. There, beneath a weather-worn fig tree, stood the entrance to the family vault, a small, sunken doorway carved into the earth and sealed with a round stone, marked by the Okoye symbol. The stone rolled aside, not magically, but obediently, like a loyal dog remembering its master. She descended into the vault with slow steps, every breath thick with dust and something older than language. The vault's air was cool and sharp, wrapping around her like the breath of the ancestors. Candles stood unused along the walls, and in the center was a wooden chest, carved, locked, and undisturbed. She placed her palm on it. It recognized her. Inside were the deeds, documents that bore the seal of the Okoye lineage, records of the land stretching from the Aruma Hills to the far edge of the Oju River. Not plots, not parcels, entire tracts. Land that once fed half the region. Land that oilmen, governors, and church leaders had tried to buy, only to leave with their egos limping behind them. Beneath the papers was the Okoye totem, a red stone carved into the shape of a standing woman with no eyes, her arms lifted, her feet rooted. Her grandmother had told her the story once, that the woman in the stone was not blind, but saw in ways men could not understand. Miriam held the totem in her hand. The stone was warm. It pulsed faintly, as though it remembered being passed down from woman to woman, generation to generation, never sold, never traded, always waiting. She closed the chest, cradling the totem in both hands, and walked back into the open air. The stars were clearer now, clustered above the trees like fireflies holding council. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then stopped. She stood tall in the night, No longer a wife in mourning, but a woman returned. The land beneath her feet felt alive again. Not because she stepped on it, but because she had come home as the daughter it never stopped calling. The morning crept in quietly, not with the blinding urgency of the city, but with the gentleness of a mother easing her child from sleep. Birds whispered in soft intervals, their calls rising and falling like breath, while the sun stretched its limbs across the thatched rooftops and misty fields of Aruma. Miriam sat outside the compound on a woven stool her father once carved from Iroko wood. The red totem rested in her lap, catching flecks of sunlight as if feeding on them. The smell of early firewood smoke drifted from neighboring compounds, mixed with the faint sweetness of roasted plantain. Every sound here had memory, echoes wrapped in familiarity. The clatter of a metal bucket at the stream reminded her of mornings spent chasing tadpoles with her cousins. A goat's cry in the distance brought flashes of her grandfather's funeral, where the old man was buried with his walking staff and 3 palm nuts in his mouth. In Uruma, everything meant something. The village had grown older, but not unrecognizable. Many houses now had corrugated roofs instead of thatch, and a few youths now carried phones as they fetched water, snapping photos of themselves and trees as though trying to preserve what they were already forgetting. But the soul of the village remained untouched. It lingered in the red dust that clung to bare feet and the way neighbors called each other by their family trees rather than just names. It hummed beneath the mango trees, beneath the silence of graves no longer visited. Miriam's return had not gone unnoticed. Even before the sun fully rose, a trail of whispers had already slithered through the morning air. Miriam is back. The Okoye daughter. The one who left and didn't look back. She has returned with city dust and secrets. The first visitor came just before noon, a boy no older than 12, shirtless, with skin as dark and smooth as roasted cola. He stood at the edge of the compound, unsure whether to step closer or run back the way he came. Miriam looked up from the yam she was peeling. "Yes?" she asked gently. The boy fidgeted. "My grandmother said, if you have returned, you should come to the council house. The elders will want to hear why." He scratched his arm nervously. "And she said to tell you, the land is not sleeping well." That last part made her pause. Her fingers froze mid-peel. "Thank you," she said, offering him a slice of raw yam, which he took before bolting off like a squirrel. She stood slowly, brushed off her wrapper, and returned inside to place the totem back in its wooden casing. The words circled her mind. The land is not sleeping well. That meant something, and not just metaphor. In Uruma, land was not passive. It reacted, sometimes violently, to betrayal, neglect, or ambition. She had seen a tree split in half after a chief sold part of a sacred hill without consensus. She had seen cassava rot from inside the soil when its rightful owner died without passing on the ownership rights. Land here wasn't just earth. It was history with lungs and memory with fists. As she approached the council house, the same open courtyard where her grandmother once argued into silence 3 titled men, she felt the air tighten. Elders sat in a semicircle beneath the large akpu tree, their canes resting across their laps like quiet verdicts. Flies hovered, but no one swatted them. At the center of the group was the oldest among them, Nsmadu, whose eyelids drooped like tired curtains, and whose voice could still stop a quarrel in midair. Miriam bowed slightly, not from submission, but from knowing where she stood. The old man blinked at her, then gestured toward the stool beside the chalk bowl. "You left a daughter," he said, "but you return as something heavier. Tell us what has brought you back while the soil still remembers your name." She spoke not with tears, but with steadiness, each word weighed and shaped like carved ivory. She told them of her years in the city, of the man who had once seemed like a partner and had become a stranger in her own bed. She left out the slap. It was too small to mention now, a symptom of something deeper. What mattered was how she had been pushed into forgetting, into hiding the truth of who she was. I buried my voice to build his dreams, she said, eyes fixed on the horizon. But the land called me back. The elders listened, unmoving, as though her words were being sown into the ground rather than spoken into air. When she mentioned the land Daniel had wanted to sell, their faces changed, not with surprise, but with something older, recognition. We knew the men would come, one of them muttered. They always come with sweet tongues and paper. Another elder, thin and bent like a bough, spat into the dust. If you had sold that land, the forest would have wept blood. Ensmadu raised a hand, silencing them. He studied her with eyes that had seen too much and trusted little. But you didn't sell, he said slowly. You chose to return. That is not a small thing. Miriam nodded, silent. Then you must awaken it, he said. The land has slept too long. It needs to remember who it belongs to. She was told to return the next morning, alone, before sunrise. There would be no ritual, only recognition. When the land accepts you again, Ensmadu added, you will feel it in your breath. It will not speak in words, but in weight. Night came with no ceremony. It draped itself over the village like a shawl woven by stars. Miriam sat in front of her compound, alone, wrapped in silence and thought. A single lantern flickered beside her, casting her shadow long across the ground. From the darkness, footsteps approached, a soft, slow gait that carried memory with it. It was Adaku, her cousin, the only one who had written her letters back when she first left Uruma. Adaku had grown fuller in the face, her hair threaded with strands of silver, but her smile hadn't aged a day. They embraced like women who had shared too many secrets in childhood to ever grow distant. They didn't speak at first. Instead, Adaku reached for the basin of groundnuts and began shelling them, her fingers quick, her eyes on the flame. You came back because you remembered who you were, she said finally. But you stayed because you remembered who we are. Miriam said nothing, only nodded. The stillness between them was not empty. It was layered, thick with shared memories, with the echoes of lullabies, of market day laughter, of ghost stories told under mosquito nets. Adaku looked at her. Do you still remember the stone path behind the old fig tree? Miriam smiled faintly. I walked it today. Then you know it's still waiting for you. She reached into her wrapper and brought out a folded cloth, revealing a necklace woven from red cowries and threaded charcoal beads. Grandmother made this for you. She said it would guide you back if your voice ever grew too quiet. Miriam took it with both hands, her fingers trembling just slightly. She placed it around her neck. The beads were warm, like they'd missed her. That night she dreamt of a river that called her name, of trees that bent slightly when she walked by, and of voices buried deep in the soil humming an old song with no words, only memory. The morning carried no bird song. It arrived instead with a hush, like the world had paused its breathing to watch something ancient stir. The sky hung low, wrapped in thick gray mist that rolled over the rooftops of Uruma like soft smoke. The village had not yet awakened. Even the goats were silent, huddled beneath bamboo fences, as though sensing something beyond the reach of dawn. Miriam stood in the backyard, barefoot, her wrapper tied tightly above her chest, arms crossed to keep out the early chill. Her breath floated before her like small clouds, vanishing before they could drift far. She had not slept long, only enough to rest the bones and clear the thoughts. The dream from the night before still clung to the edges of her memory, a woman with braided silver hair leading her down a trail that never ended, her face hidden, her voice only a whisper that never formed words. Yet Miriam understood it all. It wasn't a dream to be interpreted, it was a call. And she had answered. She made her way down the narrow footpath toward the shrine grove without lighting a torch. The village knew this path. The land beneath her soles was damp and familiar, each step greeted by a soft crunch of soil and fallen leaves. A cluster of fireflies flickered ahead of her, guiding her toward the clearing. At the heart of the grove, a small ring of stones marked the place. No carvings, no candles. Just a circle and silence. She stood inside it, her heart steady but alert, like a drum before it struck. Then, slowly, she unwrapped the red totem from its cloth, held it in both hands, and lowered it onto the central stone. There was no flash of light, no chant from the trees, no voice rising from beneath the earth to call her name. The land spoke differently. It spoke through memory, through weight, through the way her knees felt weaker the longer she stood still. It spoke through the shifting air, the sudden stillness of the insects, and the prickling on the back of her neck that told her she was not alone. Miriam closed her eyes. Her feet dug into the soil as if the ground was pulling her downward, not to bury her, but to anchor her. She began to hum, not a song she'd learned, but one her grandmother used to hum while grinding spices, while fetching firewood, while sitting alone beside the fire. It came from somewhere deep, older than language, and as her voice carried, the trees seemed to lean in closer. Her fingers tingled. The soil beneath her began to warm, not burn, but throb gently like a heartbeat returned to its home. When she opened her eyes, nothing had visibly changed, yet everything had. The mist had cleared slightly, revealing the tops of the trees and the morning sun trying to claw its way through. But it wasn't light that confirmed what had happened. It was the heaviness in her chest that suddenly lifted, as if something that had been misplaced was returned. The totem remained where she had placed it, but now it felt like it belonged there, like it had rooted itself into the stone. Miriam knelt not to worship, but to listen. She pressed her palm to the earth, and in that moment she felt it, something old, something awake, something that had waited for her return with more patience than she'd earned. She stayed there for a while, until the birds finally sang, their calls clear and sudden, as though the sky had given permission for the day to begin. By the time she walked back into the compound, the village was alive again, and word had already spread. The speed of a tale in Uruma outran even the fastest cart. It traveled on air, in murmurs and sidelong glances, through clucks of tongues and lowered voices behind shared calabashes of morning pap. Children ran past her without speaking, though some turned to look once they believed she wouldn't notice. An old woman stood at her gate, holding a bundle of cassava stems, waiting with a smile cracked wide like dry clay. "The land took your footsteps again," she said. "That means it has forgiven." Miriam offered a small nod, unsure of what to say. Forgiveness was not what she had sought, but if that's what the land had given, then perhaps it knew more than she did. Inside, she found Attiku already sweeping the compound, her scarf tied low on her forehead, back bent, hands steady. "The elders will come," she said without looking up. "Before sunset." Miriam walked past her into the house, her feet dragging slightly, not from exhaustion but from awareness that her days of rest were over. She prepared the kola nuts herself, washed the gourds, and wrapped the tobacco leaves in fresh banana bark. These were not tasks for decoration. They were offerings, gestures, rituals stitched from generations of protocol. She moved like someone who had lived here all her life, even though part of her had died in another city, in another room, in another moment she no longer wished to revisit. Every motion was deliberate, every breath a reminder that something had shifted, not only within her, but around her. And when the first elder arrived just before dusk, his walking stick tapping against the hardened earth like a clock running out, she did not greet him as a daughter returning to apologize. She greeted him as one who had answered the call, fulfilled the rite, and stepped fully back into what had always been hers. Far away, in the distant noise of the city, Daniel sat in his office, slouched over a desk cluttered with untouched paperwork and unanswered calls. The silence around him was not peaceful. It was filled with a kind of restlessness that only came when something inside refused to settle. He had been sleeping badly, waking up too early, eating food without tasting it. People noticed, though none said much. His secretary avoided eye contact. His friends stopped dropping by. Even the woman he had once entertained with subtle flirtations in the office kitchen now walked past him like a breeze, felt but not acknowledged. Since Miriam's departure, something had unraveled. Not suddenly, but thread by thread. It started with the realization that she wasn't picking up his calls, then deepened when he finally received a message from her cousin. She is home. She will not return. That sentence rattled more than he admitted. He hadn't believed it at first. Thought she'd cool off, maybe spend a week or two in the village, return with softened eyes and folded apologies. Then came the knock on his office door, a representative from a land agency he'd previously engaged. The man had come to discuss development plans, unaware of the new tides. "We may need to halt all proposals concerning the Uruma Valley," the man said, reading from his tablet. "Apparently, your wife, or should I say, former wife, has reclaimed full rights to the estate. She's been recognized again by the traditional council." Daniel had no words, just silence, the kind of silence that crawled into his throat and nested there. It was in that moment he realized he had not only lost her, he had never really known her. And now, whatever she was becoming without him. The air that morning was still, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Miriam stood before the clay basin under the almond tree, her hands soaked in the chill of rinse water. The hem of her wrapper clung damply to her calves, her hair wrapped in a faded scarf that smelled faintly of sandalwood and lemon leaves. She scrubbed with a quiet rhythm, her motions neither hurried nor sluggish, simply purposeful, each squeeze of fabric a kind of meditation, a grounding that anchored her to this place where time didn't race, but simply circled. The basin made soft sloshing sounds, the only real noise in the yard, save for the occasional bleating of a goat or the call of a vendor selling bitter leaf in the distance. It was a task she hadn't done in years, not since long before the city wrapped its polished fingers around her wrists, but now it felt as natural as breath. The scent of morning, earth, soap, and drying firewood clung to her skin like a reminder that here no one was performing for survival. Here, there was no one to impress with painted nails or the clipped tone of corporate greetings. There was only the land, the work, the ancestors, and the quiet honor of doing things with both hands. She paused when she heard the gate creak open. The sound of cautious footsteps followed. She didn't turn immediately. She knew who it was. Her bones told her before her eyes did. When she finally turned, Daniel stood there, arms limp at his sides, his face drawn, the tired weight of sleepless nights clinging to him like a second skin. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and dust clung to the cuffs of his trousers like a warning. His lips moved, but the first few words barely came out. She didn't speak. She looked at him the way one would regard an uninvited animal that wandered into a sacred space, not out of hatred, but out of a question too deep for the tongue. Daniel took a step forward, then paused, his eyes flitting to the basin of soaked wrappers, and then back to her face. "I didn't know what else to do," he finally muttered, his voice cracked from disuse or shame. She couldn't tell. "I came to see you, to talk." She kept her gaze level, the silence between them now thick and deliberate. He shifted on his feet. "I've made mistakes, Miriam. I know that. I see it now, clearly. I was wrong about everything. About you. About that land. About us." Still, she didn't speak. The goats behind the fence bleated again, as if urging him to finish what he had dragged all this way. "I thought I was building something for us," he continued. "I thought letting go of the past was the only way forward. I see now that you weren't holding on to the past. You were holding on to truth." She picked up the last wrapper in the basin and began to rinse it slowly, her hands never leaving the rhythm. Her silence now wasn't cold, it was dignified. Her restraint was not weakness, it was power tempered by pain. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, nearly drowned out by the wind. You wanted me to bend until I disappeared, she said, lifting the fabric and squeezing it dry. You mistook my silence for compliance. You slapped me because I said no. And now you think words are enough to fold the wound shut. Daniel swallowed hard, and his knees slightly buckled. He knelt, right there in the red dust, his trousers catching the dampness of the earth, his hands opened before him like a man begging at a temple. Please, he whispered, tell me how to fix it. But she was already lifting the basin, walking past him toward the drying line, and as the water dripped in her wake, the silence she left behind said more than any forgiveness ever could. Later that day, the elders arrived again, not for ceremony, but to offer their approval in the quiet way only village elders can, through presents, not praise. They gathered under the cola tree outside her compound, their canes resting on the ground, their bodies arranged in a wide crescent that faced the setting sun. She brought out calabashes of palm wine herself, bending slightly to greet each one. No one mentioned Daniel's visit. If they had seen him leave hours before, head bowed like a scolded child, no one said so. That was the way of the village, to speak without words, to deliver messages through posture and timing. Inz Madu, ever the watcher, nodded toward the red totem now placed on a small platform in front of the house. The land accepts your presence, he said, but it will test your weight. Do not become soft now. The valley remembers who walks with purpose and who walks with pride. Miriam nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon beyond the rooftops, the golden thread of the sun dipping behind the hills that bordered the valley she now carried like a mantle. There were decisions to make. The land was not just hers by blood, it was hers by responsibility. She had seen how quickly men arrived with papers and numbers, how they wrapped greed in gold chains and suits, how they waved offers like blessings, but took more than they ever gave. She knew that to keep this land alive, she needed more than refusal. She needed a plan, a structure, and a shield. She would gather the women, the forgotten ones, the overlooked, the widows, the daughters, the ones pushed aside during harvest and called only when pots needed stirring. They would rise together, not in anger, but in intention. Not to destroy, but to protect. She knew now what must be done, and for the first time in years, her steps felt like prophecy. In the far corners of the town, people began to whisper differently. Where once there were murmurs of her shame, how she had returned with nothing but silence and a bruised cheek, now there were quiet nods, soft admiration tucked behind lips. Children began pointing at her compound and asking questions their mothers struggled to answer. Market women paused to watch her walk past, no longer out of curiosity, but out of a rising sense that something was changing, and she was at the center of it. Some feared it, some welcomed it, but none ignored it. Daniel, too, had begun to unravel in places even he could not stitch. His clients grew fewer. His name, once spoken with respect in conference rooms, now hovered uncertainly like a breath held too long. People sensed his shift. The charm that had once filled rooms with ease now felt hollow. And worse, he began to hear her name in circles he had once controlled. At first, just whispers, then direct comparisons. You know she's doing something back there in Yuruma, someone said over drinks. Reclaiming lands. Bringing the women in might turn the whole place into something serious. He didn't respond, just stared at his drink, fingers clenched too tightly around the glass. That night, he drove alone to the river outside the city, stood by the water's edge, and for the first time in his adult life, wept without sound. The kind of tears that didn't beg for answers, only offered surrender. He knew then that some things, once broken, could never be remade, and what Miriam was building now was not something he could follow. Not anymore. The rainy season arrived as if summoned, not by calendars or forecasts, but by the unseen agreements between cloud and earth. It didn't announce itself with thunder. It came slowly, respectfully, with soft rains that tapped against rooftops like knuckles knocking gently on familiar doors. Yuma transformed. The dry, cracked roads turned to rich brown rivers. The leaves swelled green and heavy, hanging like blessings after long silence. Rivers that had receded behind stone now flowed freely, singing their old songs in hushed voices. For Miriam, each rain felt like a message from the land itself, reminding her of growth, cleansing, and quiet strength. She walked more now, bare feet pressing into wet earth, not minding the mud that kissed her ankles. Her clothes often clung damp against her back, but she never rushed to dry them. This was a season of allowing. The compound thrived under her hands. Roofs were mended, the walls repainted with fresh red clay. A new yam barn had been built behind the kitchen house, and plantain suckers now curved proudly in the corners of the yard. She had stopped waiting for anyone to return. She no longer counted time in weeks or memories. Her mornings began with firewood, her afternoons with meetings, and her evenings with the hum of women's voices weaving their hopes into baskets and strategies. They came in small groups at first, young mothers carrying babies, widows with folded wrappers, girls with questions pressed into their eyes like seeds waiting to sprout. They came not to mourn, but to build, and she welcomed them not as their leader, but as their mirror, letting each voice find its place. Something larger than pride had rooted itself in the soil beneath her feet. It was purpose, not shouted from rooftops, but passed from hand to hand like peeled cola. The land had not just remembered her, it had grown around her. What they were building was not an organization, not a protest, not even something that could fit neatly into village gossip. It was more subtle than that. It was a network of old truths reawakened. The women began documenting land claims that had been buried in old archives and family memories, sitting with elders who still remembered who once farmed which ridge, which river bend belonged to whose grandfather, and which trees had been planted during times of drought. They mapped it all, not with satellite imagery, but with stories. Every name written in charcoal on handmade cloth was a monument, every dot marked by memory. They taught one another how to read contracts, how to question offers, how to say no without flinching. And as they grew in number, so too did their confidence. Men began to take notice, not in opposition, but with cautious respect. They saw their wives rising before sunrise to attend land meetings, saw their daughters asking questions usually reserved for town criers. Even the chiefs, once comfortable in their quiet negotiations with external buyers, began sitting straighter in village meetings, careful with their words. The shift wasn't loud. It was like water rising behind a cracked dam, slow but undeniable. Miriam watched it unfold without claiming credit. She no longer needed applause. Every time a woman walked into her compound with shoulders straighter than the last time, she felt her grandmother's spirit nodding somewhere between the trees, and she understood then what had truly been passed down through the generations. Not just land, not just legacy, but language, unspoken, rooted, strong. There were still battles ahead. Developers had not disappeared. Greed had not given up. But now the women of Iruma did not stand alone. They stood together, arms not linked in protest, but hands inked with purpose. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. What was once trampled had grown back thicker. What was once silent now sang in voices carried by wind and rain alike. Beyond the hills, in the hushed coldness of his flat in Ama River City, Daniel lived like a ghost of himself. His days blurred into each other, marked only by the shifting shadows on his walls and the slow dusting of memories he could no longer chase away. The office visits had grown fewer. He stopped checking the news. Even his friends no longer called to ask what had happened. The silence wasn't malicious. It was empty, like a room where laughter had once lived, but packed up without warning. Daniel sat most evenings staring at the ceiling, asking himself questions he once thought only weak men asked. How had he missed it? How had he mistaken something so solid for a fleeting phase? He had told himself for years that he was building a future for the both of them, when in truth he had been building a cage, one she refused to die in. And now, every breath he took felt like it echoed in a space too large for one man's regret. One night, unable to resist, he drove back toward Yuruma, stopping just short of the main footpath that led to her village. He didn't call, didn't walk in. Just sat in the car for hours, watching the outline of the hills, listening to the chorus of crickets and wind. He thought of the slap, not just the act, but everything that led to it, the entitlement, the fear, the hunger to dominate what he didn't understand. A bird landed on the car hood and flew off almost instantly, startled by his stillness. He rolled the window down and whispered her name once. The night didn't answer. The village remained still, not rejecting him, but not calling him either. He turned the key and drove back before dawn, knowing full well that what he had lost was not something that could be asked for twice. Seasons continued to pass, and with them came more growth, more clarity. Miriam never remarried. Not because offers didn't come, they did, usually from men who mistook her solitude for loneliness, but because she had found something larger than companionship. She found peace, one not handed to her, but planted deep by the choices she now made without apology. Her son, now a teenager, began visiting more often during school holidays. At first, he had questions. Why had she left? Why had things changed? But over time, he began to understand. He saw her differently now, not just as his mother, but as someone people looked up to without needing her to shout. He watched her speak in council meetings where men waited for her opinion. He listened as villagers told stories about the Okoye line, his line, and the woman who reclaimed it. One afternoon, he stood beside her in the farm she had reopened, both of them barefoot, the soil soft and rich after a week of rain. "You ever regret leaving him?" he asked, not accusingly, just curious. She looked up at the sky, squinting against the sunlight. "I regret staying as long as I did," she answered. And with that, he said nothing more. Years passed like chapters in a book she no longer feared to read. The compound expanded. The land flourished. The people remembered. And Miriam, daughter of Ojigo, granddaughter of Elechi, woman of earth and fire, remained, not as a queen, not as a martyr, but as a woman who had been broken, buried, and still chose to bloom. The hills of Yuruma bore her name now, not in stone, but in how they stood each morning, proud and rooted. And whenever the wind passed through her trees, it carried a whisper that could only be heard by those who listened closely. A whisper that said she rose, and the land rose with her. In this life, never let anyone make you feel small just because they fear your strength. Don't trade your voice for comfort or your roots for approval. If something is sacred to you, be it your dream, your dignity, or your destiny, protect it like your name depends on it, because it does. And no matter how far life pushes you away from who you are, always remember, it's never too late to return to yourself. Your value doesn't decrease because someone else couldn't recognize it. You are not lost. You are just on your way back to power. May you never bow where you are meant to stand. May your voice never be silenced by fear or shame. May the ground beneath your feet always recognize your name and rise to meet your steps. May the people who walk into your life learn to honor your worth, not challenge it. May your heart stay soft, but your spirit unshakable. May your gifts find the right soil to flourish. And may the journey ahead be full of peace, purpose, and power. If you receive it, say aloud and strong, "Amen." Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.